Hey everyone. Um, I'm back, and I've grown a bush. Yep, up here of all places. Um, yeah, so things have been pretty easy going. I've been getting into the habit of gratitude journals, the habit of abstaining from alcohol, the habit of obeying my corporate masters, if you want to say it that way. Um, and I've just been bored otherwise. Watching various Netflix series, Hulu series, listening to a podcast about history and all the myths surrounding various facts that people take for granted that aren't real, um, or they just aren't legitimate facts. So, you know, what does success mean? What does what is success, and why does the satisfaction that we get from succeeding at something matter to us so much? The obvious answer to many is it helps one feel a sense of importance and vitality, like they've actually achieved something of value. But what about those who don't care about achievement? What about those who are always happiest when they're making someone's life better? And why do I struggle to separate the two? Like, if I truly wanted to make a difference in someone else's life, then at some point, I would also need to balance that out with achieving something just for external merit. This isn't a hard concept for a lot of people to grasp, as it's probably cut out in their heads generally what success looks like. But the problem with that is that with people who are more perceptive and who aren't oriented towards rule setting or schedule making or just planning out an entire week with all the ins and outs and just hoping that whatever sticks is able to stick well. They don't gravitate towards this as easily. It's a lot of more shaky ground. And what I've noticed in my life is that I thrive too much off of my external locus to be even really taken seriously as a person who does have legitimate goals. Because most goals are often dictated by an environmental impetus. Even if you think you can be natural with your goals, chances are you probably aren't. Like, there's going to be some downfalls in assuming that what you're doing is actually you organically, and the essential you-ness that you can impose on the environment is a product of your own making. It, if you follow like what psychologists as well as studies of existential dilemmas will tell you, every product of our being comes from an outside source. So, but the scary part of that is a lot of us, once we recognize this, will probably feel a general lackluster take on life set in. And it will just continuously pervade until we realize that the sense of novelty we get comes ultimately from what we desire to do. And if that desire can hurt other people, then why does it matter to us so much, right? Like, some people, are looked down on for having virtually no lack of morality. But isn't that still just their inner voice talking? Isn't that what gets them through the day? Just the fact that they weren't made for anything, life is meaningless, they've just taken nihilism to the nth level, and they're just thriving on autopilot, going around just abusing animals and torturing random people with a penetrating gaze or stare. It's something a lot of people don't enjoy thinking about, but it it really does hold some sway. Like, morality isn't fluid. Morality comes from aesthetics and what we feel is right and what we prioritize as humans. Doesn't mean it can't be objective. It just means that if there are people whose morality we can't override and lord it over them that what they're doing is wrong, then if our only answer is just weed these people out and kill them, right? Like, I mean, why would we want to keep them around if ultimately we needed something to uphold? And if your answer to the question we shouldn't do that, we should keep them around and let them continue to do their heinous acts, then isn't it on us if people we love end up sacrificed, just as a metaphor, just as a hypothetical scenario? Yeah, but I don't know, just the feeling of helplessness that comes on a person when they realize that there's very little they can do to actually improve their lives beyond whatever society values and says is most important. It leads to a stoic uphill push. It's the only way to truly facilitate the part of ourselves that is most essential and most vital to our sense of direction as people. I personally have very, very dark intentions, like inside. I don't always show them to people because they disgust me and I find them inherently flawed and just I want to kick them out. But the issue is more with acceptance, right? So even if people look down on you and criticize you, what would it take for you to continue to hold unto yourself that part that everybody else detests and questions because it seems morally reprehensible and goes against a societal standard? Ultimately, what therapy seems to be granting us and telling us we need to forget about whether or not people will like us, it seems rather hypocritical because if therapy is ultimately intended to bring out the best in a person, what if that best counteracts something in society that would be for our benefit to uphold? Well, obviously, at that point, the only rational answer is it comes down to personal choice. All right, that's all fine and good. What if someone ends up praising you for choosing to do something that goes against their moral system? Right? Like, how does that add up? Why are there so many people in our society who have that you do you, live and let live attitude? But then when it comes to things that they want for themselves, suddenly they get all defensive. Everyone around you is a hypocrite to some degree. We are all flawed beings. Religion acknowledges this. That's why we have religious dogma. It's an invention. It's a moral invention to try to get people to a place where they are realizing where the core center of their instincts is coming from and why it matters so much to extinguish it when it doesn't benefit them or anyone else in their vicinity, their circle. And too often, I find myself not on a quest for understanding, but just a quest for happiness and satisfaction. But what happens when that search for happiness feels perverted or diluted? Some would argue that this is actually all the more reason to govern ourselves with a higher system of values, one that would come from, let's say, an all-supreme being. Thing about that is, if you've been an agnostic atheist your whole life, or not your whole life, but just part of your life after you've deconverted, you're going to have all this background of knowledge from religion, and it's going to throw you into a tizzy. It's going to make you realize, what have I truly lost from dissociating from something that I knew I could no longer do, which was go to church, which was embrace church norms and values and the standards upheld by whichever denomination or class sect I happen to ascribe to, either through pressure or from familial indoctrination, any source. But like, if it starts to grow more appealing to you the longer you've been away from it, then maybe it's all you need just to get through the day, just to find a deeper sense of connection. Because ultimately, I think that's what most people crave, even if they don't necessarily think that's where it comes from or why it matters. A lot of people really are just looking for something to lean back on. Because you mentioned ChatGPT in a setting where you're surrounded by religious people. Well, not necessarily surrounded by them, but you have, like, let's say, 2 in the room who are devout Christians, right? And they talk to you and your relationship with ChatGPT as though it matters, and they talk about it as though it's relevant. Could that be a form of cowardice on their part for choosing not to stand up and say, I believe that ChatGPT is from the devil, right? Because Christianity would think so, wouldn't it? It's a human contrivance that's taking over our lives. I mean, sure, it can be a useful tool to some believers who would think that it would have a utilitarian purpose, but if they don't go about telling you, hey, that tool that you're using is a work of God and it's inspired by divine merit, they know they'd be lying. They know that they would be getting something wrong, a little off, and that's why they're afraid to talk about it. See? So, ultimately, because I realize this about the flaws of religious systems and belief viewpoints, I don't like to go into any of it thinking, oh, I'm just going to be on a path of redemption. Because ultimately, faith doesn't lead you in that direction. All you essentially have to do is everything that happens to you is a result of faith. But the problem is, if a religious person tells you, you realize that's where everything comes from, it's like, great. But if that's what is guiding me through the day, what's the point in even embracing the religion at all? Just something to consider. I struggle so much with just my narrow-mindedness, my blatant skepticism, my frankly narcissistic traits, like other things, just negative qualities about myself. I take note of it, but I don't own it. I don't do the thing that therapists encourage, that people in normal society tell you, which is just be yourself. No, it's impossible. You can't be yourself if you know it's going to cause you internal pain and conflict. Too many ideas in this world are just too toxic, but yeah, I just like dispelling these thoughts as a means of getting out of my head, getting into the sphere that's around me. And I mean, I'm hoping one of these days I might actually start up a Twitch account and maybe even make it compatible with YouTube so I can stream seamlessly. That would actually be very fun to me, I think. But, until then, I'm just in this realm of like making casual uploads and, seeing where it takes me. Because the journey for life for me is quite unpredictable, and honestly, I have a throughout my life I've just carried it with me, the tendency to look at external sources and people around me for validation of what I am processing internally, and that's not healthy. You shouldn't look at what's outside of you and see it as a means of limiting or making you feel lower or lesser than what you could be. And that's essentially what goes on. I see people who have traits and things that I grow quite jealous of, but then I also notice, wow, they're also getting into fights, and they also have, their own personal struggles. It's like, Jesus, this really is an ongoing issue, an ongoing dilemma. But yeah, like I said, I just really enjoy the feeling of being able to get this stuff out of my head and hopefully grow my audience the more I roll out content. So, as always, merci beaucoup for listening.